All right, we're going to do some salty statistics because, everyone loves doing math on a Friday. So something you'll hear a lot in this space of online ministry and online church is a statistic that came out of the pandemic and is being used as justification for further expansion into the space, for further use of online services, for church, for online tools for church, all that kind of stuff. It comes out of, like I said, the early days of the pandemic. It comes from an article and just kind of resource that Barna group put together. They're a Christian organization, and this is from back in June 2020. So just as the kind of pandemic was really ramping up, everyone was going online, and Barna did some research to find out who was going online so we could know the numbers. And what happens with this information, I think, is important because how it's being used is not how it appears here. And it kind of highlights a problem that, if we're being honest, Christians have always had a problem dealing with statistics in an honest way. Like, we're the kind of people who will have, a family with 11 kids show up to our church service, and we will count 13 people in the sanctuary and 11 people in kids zone as if they're two different numbers. And call it even because, we're trying to boost our numbers up and show that we're doing God's work. And a family did show up, but it's this manipulation of numbers in a dishonest way that I really think is problematic, especially when we're talking about online church and the kind of dangerous road it's taking us theologically. So I'm going to read some stuff from the article and just kind of highlight kind of the things that I'm concerned about, and then we'll go from there. So it says since March of this year, Barna has been researching digital church trends that have surfaced or simply been emphasized as a result of COVID-19. That should be your first kind of like, okay, what are we dealing with? It's not that 96% of churches throughout the pandemic went online. It's that between March and whenever they were able to tabulate this data into a useful kind of form before June 3rd of 2020, that's how much time they looked at for this church to establish these statistics. That doesn't mean that these statistics aren't representative, but it's being, what you'll hear this statistic being presented as is that throughout the pandemic, 96% of churches. And that may be true. That's not what this article says. It says that in this sliver of a 1 year when it was the worst for the pandemic, really, that was when 96% of pastors reported that they were doing online services. Not that 96% of churches were going online, and we'll get to that in a bit, but that in 2 months, or less than 2 months really, that 96% of pastors were doing online services for their churches. Where we find out a kind of like nuance to that number is right after the first paragraph, where it says half of churched adults have not streamed a church service in the past 4 weeks. So again, inside that 2 month sliver that they're taking this data from the time where they tabulate the data, you have a 4-week period where half of the people, the ones that make up the church, aren't attending these online services or using them or viewing them because, for whatever reason that they are. Okay, so what you don't have is 96% of churches moving online. What you have is 96% of pastors deciding that they're going to do online services and their churches really only showing up half the time. So that's a big difference. Half of church adults is, you can just call that 50%. So 50% of churches aren't attending these live stream services or weren't attending these live stream services, but 95% of pastors are streaming them. Then what you don't have is 95% of churches moving online for their services. What you have is 45% of churches moving online, because if it's moved to the individual, if a church adult attending a church service is part of the church, then the pastor doing the service to no one because they're not attending does cut. It atomizes out what a church service is, because is a church service something that happens just because a pastor, assumes a position in the pulpit and videotapes himself? Is that church? Or is church when he does that and the people who attend his church, come together to listen to the sermon, to be discipled, to have fellowship, all that kind of stuff? Because when you put that into an online context, a pastor simply making a video exactly how I'm making a video now is not having church unless there's a response. And so what we have is this kind of mixing of statistics. This 96% of reports, or 96% of pastors that streamed online services, is being used as the justification for that churches are adopting this, without the caveat that half of the adults during the time when this statistic happened weren't going to these church services. They weren't participating in that 96% for whatever reason. And I would argue rightly for that reason, that it wasn't church that they were attending. So this kind of statistic manipulation, this statistic fudging, is something that is prone to the church. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. We're Christians. We've all had ministries that we've worked in before, and numbers get fudged, okay? You have a big Dutch family come in with 11 kids, 13 people total. Do you put 13 people in the sanctuary? Or do you put 11 people in Kid Zone? Do you do both? Because sometimes this stuff happens. Sometimes it happens because you have multiple people tracking things and the numbers don't cross, and without a way to kind of make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, this kind of thing can happen. So every time I hear this 96% of churches went online during COVID, I always wondered where it went to, and I did some digging and I found the article, and that's not what's being said. That's not what's being reported, okay? For a sliver of time, 96% of pastors were producing online content, and half the church wasn't showing up. That's the actual fact. So don't forget that when you hear someone talk about that. That's the actual fact. So like I said, Salty Statistics with Mike on a Friday. I hope you're having a great day.